Nancy Rawson from the Monell Center. Wonderful presentations. Thank you so much, everybody. Very exciting. One of the issues I would like your thoughts on is discrimination of fat content in the foods that we're trying to identify that people are eating, which, you know, a higher fat yogurt from a lower fat really looks pretty much the same as far as I can tell. But a way of going about this might be to incorporate detection of the volatiles from these foods, which Dr. Kreidel mentioned briefly. So what are your thoughts about going after the type of technology that would be required to incorporate that into these types of monitoring systems? Certainly there's still a ways to go, but is it worth going after, or are there other ways to get there? Thank you.
Me? I think it's worth going after. I think any type of new data we can get, I think would be quite. Oh, is it on? Can you hear me now? Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I think those types of sensors, there's ways to go, and right now versions of those sensors are quite expensive, and they're a little bit larger. But I think, yeah, I think that would be very useful. One of the things that we have been able to do is we can learn some of that from people's diets, the way they make choices. So I give the example, if we would take a picture of my wife's food and you saw milk, it was going to be fat-free milk, or she wouldn't drink milk. It would be water. So I think you can get that contextual information that helps, but I think some of these other sensors are coming down the road. You know, one of the things none of us really talked about was, you know, we're going to collect all this information, and what about the privacy implications of all of this? Well, it sort of scares me. You want to say something?
Well, yeah, maybe on privacy, actually, it was interesting because a friend messaged me last night asking me what our app was, and I told him, and he said because they had been collecting data using another well-known app, and since this has been being recorded, I won't name it, but and he said it was shocking in terms of what they might or might not be doing with his data. So I do think that's just a whole other area. But I wondered with the low fat options, if could it be that these machine learning approaches, I mean, I imagine the sort of meniscus and the appearance. I know it looks like a yogurt, but there could be subtle differences, or more air, or more something, you know, in a product that you might be able to see.
I mean, I know one of the things that we've tried to exploit is if you look at low fat milk very carefully, does anybody know what you see? What does it look like? It looks blue. Okay. Now that I've told you this, you always will see it. I'm sorry. And we've tried to exploit that. Yeah, we've tried. Yes, that's exactly right. We've tried to exploit that. We haven't been as successful as we'd like to, but I think along that line, I think it's coming. The resolution on these devices are getting better and better. But I think this whole idea of learning more about the user, of course, that then also does have implications on privacy that we have to be very careful about. And I think, you know, there's issues. You know, one of the things that we also use, I didn't get a chance to talk about, is we use the location that people are eating. So and not all the time we can get it approved by the IRB, but when we can get it approved by the IRB, we collect location information. We can tell a lot about what somebody is doing in their diet by also knowing something about where they're eating. And I think, and that gets into some weird things too.
So very quickly, I think there's some imaging technologies that can be repurposed, like for anti-submarine warfare, some of the things that are used in satellites just to survey crops and crop health and so on around the world, that could be applied here that would actually get at fat content and content of the food. I don't think that's far out at all. It's just a question of somebody deciding to go after that piece. The other thing on privacy, I think our generation's concerned about privacy, but you know, things shift over time. And when cameras first came out, there was a lot of public discussion about whether they should be banned because you might infringe on somebody's privacy by getting a picture of them doing something in public that, you know, they didn't agree could be shared. And nowadays with the Twitter generation, they're talking to each other about exactly what they're doing at that moment in time. And, you know, our genetic information, whether we like it or not, is being made more publicly available. There's enough information, at least from people of European extraction, in the U.S. apparently for these crime fighters to actually locate relatives and figure out sort of who those people are, just from the database that already exists that has been shared. So, you know, privacy is changing, and I think it's more our concern, but this new generation seems to have a different viewpoint.
Well, let me inject one thing on that. I disagree with you in a little bit. Yes, I think I hang around with a lot of young people, okay? That's part of my job. And I find that they're less concerned about privacy maybe right now, but as they get a little bit older, they are. And, you know, my feeling right now is thank God for the European Union and their recent rules on the data privacy, which I think has really affected a lot of American companies, and I'm very happy that that happened.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I can't get started on GDPR. It's just been a complete nightmare, but I think the principles are right. It's just that actually application of it to everything has been it's madness.
It hasn't been clean. I agree with that.
No.
Thank you for all the answers. We have to stop you now because we have a line of.
Thank you. Jo Sanko with ILSI North America. I had a question for Carl. What do you think is the greatest resistance to the success of the fifth revolution? And the second question is, when is the sixth revolution coming, and what's going to be in it?
Well, there's a lot of stuff on the internet about what the sixth revolution might look like. And that's sort of implantables and kind of like shared feelings, right? We're already talking about that for soldiers in squads, where with these wearables, you can sort of share a spidey sense. So a guy on the outer edge that senses something, the whole group is sharing that feeling. You know, we're going to have something like that evolving quickly. I think, what was the first part of your, I'm sorry.
That's the problem when you have long questions. The first part is, what will be the resistance to the
Oh, yes.
success of the fifth revolution?
Thanks. So it's what we always see, where people want to do what they're comfortable with. So anything that's innovative tends to be disruptive. You know, iPhones are disruptive. The internet was disruptive. I remember when I first joined the Army, you know, we used to fill out a form when we wanted to send a message up to higher headquarters, and it would go through our commander, and then it'd go to the next guy, and they'd go to the next guy, and they'd each endorse it, and it was on this piece of paper. Then we suddenly had the internet, and the Surgeon General could reach down to Captain Friedel, ask me a question, and I could answer it directly and cut through all of those levels of the way we were organized, and it completely changed our organization. And the question was, you know, then, so how do we handle that? Well, it's who else needs to know so that my commander could try to chase those electrons to Washington, D.C. and head it off if I'd already sent the message. You know, it's disruptive, and so there's a natural force in all the organizations, especially big bureaucratic organizations, to resist that kind of change, which is good, so we don't flip from one good idea to the next too rapidly. But you've got to sort of bring people along, and sometimes we don't have a choice. And I think with all this AI revolution, we don't have a choice. So it's sort of like the tsunami that's about to come over us. I mean, you see it in Google and everything else. It's already sort of reading your email while you write it and figuring out what ads it's going to present to you. We want to be a little more thoughtful about how we use that technology and make sure that we don't have unintended consequences. And again, back to this theme of obesity being one of the consequences of, you know, all this convenient technology that makes it easier for us not to work, not to exercise too hard, and to eat too much. You know, we have to think about how we use that technology and structure it to help us.
Thank you.
Richard Williams, FDA retired, now a writer. In addition to the technologies that you talked about, how much would smart toilets help in terms of improving the accuracy of what people are taking in?
So there are people that are interested in that for sure, you know, that'll do your biochemistry. And I suspect our Japanese friends will be the first in line with this because of those Toto toilets that'll do everything for you now. You know, it makes sense. It's an area that some people sort of are afraid to go into, but you want to measure everything in and everything out, and that's a way to get at it. I think it's going to be very important, and we're going to see it.
Okay.
Thank you for amazing talk from all of you. So I have a question for Professor Kate. Hi, how are you? So I'm Nisak from Malaysia. So I would like to ask about the future application of the metabolomics and how it's related to dietary pattern, because we know that as we collect the data, no matter what kind of technology, it requires human effort to snap a photo and upload. So when you do that repeatedly, it kind of perhaps reduce the adherence. So how would you anticipate the future of metabolomics? Because I heard about the word nutri-types approach. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it is a whole other area, as it were, but I think that there's certainly been some work published last year, maybe the year before, which shows that you could identify kind of patterns of food intake through the metabolome that's identified. But to my mind, it feels like it, and it's very detailed, very expensive. Now, all these things might get cheaper and quicker and easier. So as they do, maybe it becomes more practical. But at the moment, it's not a very practical option. And it feels to me like it would be a whole lot quicker and easier to ask people what they ate rather than to go through all of that identification. And also, the metabolites that are identified through the metabolomics approach are not specific. They target in on certain types of food, but couldn't really give you the detail of what was eaten. So it just depends, I suppose, what you want to do with it. But I think there's use for it. I think maybe as a sort of a cross-check, you know, how reliable is what we've captured elsewhere. That could be helpful. And maybe down to supporting individualized prescriptions of, you know, dietary patterns to go forward. Again, knowing something about sort of metabolomic profile of the individual might be useful. But it's still quite early stages, I would say, for that.
I think that's a really important point. You know, metabolomics is yet to sort of prove itself out. It's a very interesting tool, but we don't know what to do with this yet. And there's the risk that we use technology to answer questions that, you know, don't need that kind of technology. That happens all the time, doesn't it?
Right, it does.
It's the cool new sexy technology. And, you know, it's like if we had a high-quality acoustic sensor on a wearable to listen for somebody's stomach growling so we know that they're hungry, you know, so we know when to feed soldiers. Well, that's not really important, actionable information. The soldiers will tell us, you know, it's not like a dumb automobile that can't tell you when the fuel tank's running low. So we have to be careful not to misapply the technology to questions that could be done in a much more pedestrian and probably better way.
Okay, our co-chair wants to ask a question.
Sorry.
Hi, well, first of all, thank you very much to all of our speakers for such interesting lectures today. Really open up our minds of the potential of what is coming up. I have a question for Dr. Kate. You mentioned that some of these tools that help the assessment of the dietary intake use databases based on the information that the pre-packed products have, the nutritional information. And I also saw that you include in one of your slides, you mentioned about the public-private partnerships. So my question is, and coming from industry as myself, is what do you think food industry could do in order to support the development of this data, the development of studies on dietary patterns assessment?
Oh, thank you. Well, it is something that I think is really, really important. We have to work together, don't we, as researchers and industry. And I suppose what I would love is for industry to be willing to share data around the food composition information, around sales at a certain level, so that we can, not sales so that we know who's making profit. That's not what I'm talking about. It's just as a marker of intake, really, as something that gives us some idea of who's eating what where, so that we can then track that linking back to nutritional values of the data that's been provided through the food composition information and so on. And I can see that individual companies want to be very protective of some of that data, and so we would need to have a really secure sort of set of agreements between each company, and potentially, I suppose I'm putting forward here, and it's not my place to do it, but I feel like something like the World Health Organization could be a trusted third party. That means that, as it were, everyone puts into that bank. I mean, in the UK and perhaps elsewhere, there's a company called Brand Bank that looks after front and back of pack nutrient labeling information for companies, and they get paid by companies to store and keep their data. I'm not quite really sure what the business model is for that, but that doesn't go far enough, really, and they just look after it like a library. Whereas actually what we need to do is apply this information when we know what's out there in circulation, what's in our stores, who's buying it, and tracking that over time. I mean, we can do that through simple, cross-sectional survey repeated stuff, which is what we've done in the past. But let's try and use all this new technology. Yeah. So somehow getting companies together to agree, yes, we will share this data, not with each other necessarily, but with some sort of health-focused organization, knowing that it's not a name and shame, this company is terrible, that company is better. It's not that. It's about tracking, seeing how we can track food in our society today, really.
No, thank you. Definitely it's information that the companies use to track, have whole departments for that consumer insights. And it's interesting to think and discuss how this could be done.
Could we? Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? If not, I have a question for Dr. Delph. You have developed methods to use on app of iPhone. So is it possible that someday in the future you can develop something wearable, such as glasses, as mentioned in Dr. Friedl's work?
Yeah. I mean, we're already doing that. I mean, among other things, the camera that's on the chew sensor we're doing with Edward Chabanaz is, you can think of it as a wearable camera. And so, yes, we're already working on that. And so we actually we have a grant proposal into NIH on exactly this.
Thank you.
So Google Glasses was a little ahead of its time, but something like that's probably going to come back.
Well, no, we participated with Google on the Google Glasses thing. So we already have about 100,000 food images taken with Google Glass. So.
And then I suspect our Japanese friends will be the first to actually implement something like that. It'll be nationwide. Everyone will be measuring their inches. Is that right? Yeah.
We still have 6 minutes, so please.
Sorry, Cho-san-ku with ILSI North America. This is a question for Dr. Sasai. I know in your study you were looking at 12 different wearables and also comparing that against the double label water. And I know your sample size was also small. Did you see any gender difference in, when you're looking at different types of variables and comparison against the DLW?
So of course we have data, but we have not looked at the gender differences because so now it's 10 male and 9 females, and I guess there is slight difference in age as well between genders in our population. So that's why we have not looked at the data in terms of the gender differences. But I'm not sure whether there is a difference in validity for the wearable devices in or in terms of gender. So I'm not sure.
Okay.
So.
There might be subtle influences of anthropometry, for example, on how people move between genders, you know, as a group, but of course that breaks down.
Yes. I think in terms of physical activities in Japan, the female participants probably are spending a lot of lifestyle activities, not locomotive, like housework chores and others. So they have a low intensity, but more time spent in low intensity activities. But for male, I think they are likely to, spend more the moderate intensities. But the activity time is probably lower in male than females.
Yes, please.
So at the risk of sounding like a 21st century Luddite, I'll ask a question. If this technology is embraced and we're collecting all these data for every bit of human life, plus all the photos we take as we're wandering around, are there long-term concerns about storing all these data? The assumption is that technology is going to keep getting better and computer power will continue to increase. But is that the case, or is it finite? At some point, we're going to have problems with just storing all this information, and in the future, people will look back and say, what were those people thinking with all this information we're collecting without necessarily an indication of where they're going to go with it? I'm just interested in thoughts on that.
It seems unlimited.
Well, I think that there are some technologies that are going to be coming along that will help with storing. I know as recently as 8 years ago, there were some issues that worrying about some of the bigger companies like Google, Facebook, maybe IBM. We're going to be using all the hard drive capability in the world, and we as humans, consumers, would not be able to buy any hard drives for our computers. But that's all changed, and I think I'm not so much worried about the technology for storing it. I'm more worried about the persistence factors and be able to how much of this data you want to back up, how much you want to be able to keep. I think the storage technology will be there, and I think you're seeing more improvements, solid-state devices and things like that. So I'm not so much worried about the technology being there. I'm more worried about how are we going to manage it, manage the provenance and things like that of the data.
This goes back to the resistance to change in the fifth industrial revolution as well. So, the DoD is a perfect model. We're moving to cloud computing. And say, oh yeah, okay, so we'll prepare for cloud computing. And they're beginning to commence, to initiate, to start, to think about how we're going to do that and make it cyber safe, right? And they just can't come up with a solution. We thought we were going to have something last year, and they go, oh yeah, it's coming soon, coming soon. Meanwhile, we have things like in the NHANES data, there was 3 years of data collection with actigraphy, 1 week of wrist-worn actigraphy in a sampling of the American population. And they have more data from that than all the data they've ever collected in all the rest of NHANES, apparently. And it's in the cloud. And they haven't figured out quite how to digest this down so that it can be shared with the rest of the public. We're going into like about year 3 or 4 of it's coming, it's coming. I think we're going to see it soon, but it's a problem because it had to go to the cloud because there's so much data. So we don't seem to be limited by storage. Somehow we keep catching up to, we have smart engineers who figure out how to give us even more storage space. That doesn't seem to be the limiter. It's us catching up to how we can access that much data and what we're going to do with it within our own sort of bureaucratic rules and regulations and all the things that sort of try to control it.
As we are approaching the end of the session, I would like to ask you to please take a few moments to complete an evaluation form on your APP so that we can improve our future scientific sessions. I want to thank you all for participating in this most inspiring session. I believe it's a very successful session. Let's thank all our speakers And I also like to thank the organizer of the session, Dr. Connie Weaver. Thank you.
Just to